Hello, and thank you for taking the time to review this recorded webinar on Seattle gig worker protections. More specifically, this webinar will cover gig worker paid sick and safe time and gig worker premium pay laws. This webinar was created by the Seattle Office of Labor Standards, and I, Darius Foster, along with my colleague Jasmine Marwaha, will serve as the facilitators. Before we start, I'd like to recite the following disclaimer. This webinar is for informational purposes only. It is not for the purpose of providing legal advice, creating an agency decision, or establishing an attorney-client relationship between the Office of Labor Standards and the recipient. Any responses to specific questions are based on the facts as we understand them and are not intended to apply to any other situations. If you need legal advice, please consult an attorney. Moving along, here are the main objectives for this presentation, which include a brief history of the Seattle Office of Labor Standards, commonly referred to as OLS, for folks who are not familiar with the office, understanding the intention of each law, understanding who is covered under each law, and understanding key requirements under each law. The first law we will cover is gig worker paid sick and safe time. But first, here's a brief introduction about OLS. Seattle passed its first labor standard in 2012. And between 2012 and 2015, it passed a total of 4 labor laws. In 2015, the city created the Office of Labor Standards to implement and enforce the city's labor laws. The mission of OLS is grounded in workplace equity. This is done by advancing labor standards through thoughtful community and business engagement, strategic enforcement, and innovative policy development with a commitment to race and social justice. Okay, without further delay, I'd like to hand over the presentation to Jasmine, who will present on gig worker paid sick and safe time. Thank you.
Thanks, Darius. My name is Jasmine Marwaha, and I'm a policy analyst with the Seattle Office of Labor Standards. I'll be discussing the Gig Worker Paid Sick and Safe Time Ordinance. The Gig Worker Paid Sick and Safe Time Ordinance provides certain gig workers access to paid sick and paid safe time from transportation network companies and food delivery network companies that arrange for a delivery of groceries or prepared food using an app-based or online platform. We refer to this type of paid sick and safe time as gig worker PSST to distinguish this from traditional employer-provided PSST. And as we'll discuss in detail in this presentation, gig worker PSST allows workers to accrue and use 24-hour increments of paid leave to care for their own health and safety or the health and safety of a family member under qualifying circumstances. This temporary law went into effect on July 13, 2020, and the requirement to provide gig worker PSST will expire 180 days after the end of any COVID-19 civil emergency. The entire law itself will end 3 years after the end of the civil emergency to allow for any enforcement action needed. So, what hiring entities are obligated to provide gig worker PSST? Well, the law applies to transportation network companies that are licensed according to Seattle Municipal Code 6310 and food delivery network companies, which we'll get into in a minute, that have hired 250 or more gig workers worldwide. So what is this food delivery network company that we've been talking about? Well, the ordinance defines a food delivery network company as an organization that offers pre-arranged delivery services for compensation using an online-enabled application or platform to connect customers with workers for delivery from one or more of the following: eating and drinking establishments, food processing establishments, grocery stores, or any facility supplying groceries or prepared food and beverages for an online order. Basically, we are looking at where is the delivery coming from, as opposed to scrutinizing what is being delivered. And if it's being delivered from a place that typically processes or prepares food or beverages, then we will most likely consider that a food delivery network company. So which workers are covered? Well, gig workers. which is defined in the ordinance as anyone accepting offers of prearranged delivery or transportation services for compensation from a TNC or an FDNC. To be covered under the ordinance, they must have at least one pickup or drop-off in the city of Seattle. And all gig workers performing work in Seattle for a TNC or an FDNC have gig worker PSST rights, including gig workers who are not legally authorized to work in the United States. Per the City of Seattle policy, OLS does not ask people about their immigration status, and we investigate complaints without regard to an individual's status. In addition, the worker must also not otherwise be covered under traditional employer-provided PSST under Seattle Municipal Chapter 1416. Essentially, the worker can't get both gig worker PSST and regular PSST from the same company for the same work. If the worker is entitled to PSST as an employee, they must get those protections, and this law is intended for gig workers who do not have access to PSST otherwise. Covered gig workers earn 1 day of gig worker PSST for every 30 days worked in Seattle since October 1st, 2019. And a day worked in Seattle is any calendar day with at least one pickup or drop-off in the city, which essentially means if they had one pickup in Seattle and they worked the rest of their day in Tacoma, that day would still count as a day worked for purposes of accrual. And every 30 days work that they had at least one pickup or drop-off, they would get 1 day of PSST, which is essentially a 24-hour paid increment, as we will get into later on in this presentation. Gig workers can use their gig worker PSST as either paid sick time or paid safe time. Paid sick time covers a gig worker or their family member, defined as a child, grandparent, parent, parent-in-law, sibling or grandchild, or spouse or domestic partner, and it can be used if the worker or family member needs care related to mental or physical illness, injury or health condition, medical appointment, or preventive medical care. Paid safe time covers a gig worker, family member, household member, or roommate, and it can be used for reasons related to domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking that affect the gig worker or the family member, household member, or roommate. It can also be used when the hiring entity has suspended or discontinued operations by an order of a public official to limit exposure to an infectious agent, biological toxin, or hazardous material. When a gig worker's family member's school or place of care has been closed, one may also use paid safe time, as well as when the hiring entity has reduced, suspended, or otherwise discontinued operations for any health or safety related reason. Typically, paid safe time is not authorized to be used for snow days. A gig worker can start using their gig worker PSST after they have accrued their first day if they have worked for the hiring entity in Seattle within the previous 90 days. Hiring entities must make gig worker PSST available within 1 week after they have accrued the leave. When a gig worker has gig worker PSST available, the worker may use it by requesting to do so through the electronic process provided by the hiring entity. Once requested, the use begins immediately and lasts 24 hours. When gig workers request gig worker PSST from a hiring entity, they are expected not to accept a trip or delivery for the next 24 hours, and hiring entities must notify the workers when that 24-hour increment of gig worker PSST will end, so they know when not to accept a trip or delivery. If a gig worker accepts a trip or delivery during that 24-hour period that they are supposed to be on leave, the hiring entity may not penalize the gig worker, but they can deny the gig worker payment for that day of gig worker PSST and return that day back to the worker's accrued balance of gig worker PSST. Hiring entities must pay out gig worker PSST within 14 calendar days of the request or at the next regularly scheduled date of compensation. If a gig worker requests more than 3 consecutive days of gig worker PSST, a hiring entity may, but does not have to, request reasonable information to verify that a gig worker is taking leave for a covered reason. The hiring entity cannot inquire about the nature of the use or any specifics, only that the reason is an authorized one. During a COVID-19 civil emergency, a doctor's note or healthcare provider verification is considered an unreasonable burden, and a hiring entity, if they do require verification for more than 3 consecutive days of gig worker PSST, must find another type of verification. So how much will a gig worker get paid for their 24-hour increment of gig worker PSST? Well, that's based on the average daily compensation, which is determined by the following steps. So first, you have to identify the gig worker's highest earning calendar month since October 1st, 2019. And to do that, you have to count the total earnings for each day with work in Seattle. And again, we defined a day with work in Seattle as, at least one drop-off or pickup in Seattle. And it just takes either one drop-off or one pickup to count as a day with work in Seattle. So you count the total earnings that entire day, and you include payments or services or bonuses, commissions, and tips. And from that total, you can identify the highest earning calendar month. Once you've identified what the highest earning calendar month is, you take those total earnings for the days with work in Seattle and you divide by the number of days with work in Seattle. So your typical average calculation. So the typical gig worker may not be able to track their highest earning calendar month and average daily compensation, particularly since October 2019, but hiring entities who do have access to that information must provide regular written notification to the gig worker of that worker's current rate of average daily compensation, as well as the updated balance of the number of gig worker PSST days that have been accrued, those that have been reduced since the last notification, and any that are available for use. This notification must be provided to the gig worker at least monthly, so that if the most recent calendar month ended up being the highest earning calendar month, that average daily compensation would then be updated to reflect that. It does not have to be provided monthly if the gig worker has not worked since the last notification. In addition, the hiring entity is required to provide a notice of rights to the gig worker that explains the requirements of the law and the right to be protected from retaliation and the right to file a complaint with OLS or to bring a civil action of this law if there is a violation. The hiring entity must also provide their policy and procedure to meet the requirements of the law, so specifically how each company is going to meet the requirements of the law. That is also required electronically, in English, and in the worker's primary language. As with all of our labor standards, retaliation is prohibited. Hiring entities and all others are prohibited from taking an adverse action or discriminating against gig workers who assert their rights to gig worker PSST. These rights include, but are not limited to, using or asking to use gig worker PSST, informing a hiring entity or legal counsel about alleged gig worker PSST violations, filing a complaint about alleged violations, participating in an investigation of alleged gig worker PSST violations, or informing other gig workers of their rights to gig worker PSST. That's it for the substantive portion of the gig worker PSST presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact our office. Questions from hiring entities are not shared with our enforcement team, and similarly, information from workers who call our office are kept confidential. Language interpretation and translation services are available, as well as accommodations for persons with disabilities, and all of our services are free. So please give us a call at 206-256-5297 or email us if you're a worker, email us at laborstandards@seattle.gov, and hiring entities can email us at business.laborstandards@seattle.gov. And either way, you can also go to our online inquiry form, which is available on our website at www.seattle.gov/laborstandards. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm going to turn it over to Darius to talk about gig worker premium pay.
Thank you, Jasmine. That's a wonderful presentation on gig worker paid sick and save time. So moving right along with our presentation, the following section is dedicated to understanding gig worker premium pay. We'll dive right in and talk about the law, who's covered, what is premium pay, and gig worker protections. The Gig Worker Premium Pay Ordinance requires food delivery network companies, or FDNCs, to pay gig workers additional compensation for delivery orders with pickup or drop-off points in Seattle. We call this additional compensation premium pay. Premium pay is in addition to compensation, bonuses, commissions, and tips owed to a gig worker for services provided. This temporary law went into effect June 26, 2020, and requirement to pay gig workers premium pay for delivery orders with pickup or drop-off points in Seattle will expire 180 days after the end of any COVID-19 civil emergency. The entire law itself will end 3 years after the end of the civil emergency to allow for enforcement if applicable. As mentioned earlier, this law applies to hiring entities that are food delivery network companies, or FDNCs. Under the law, FDNC means an organization with at least 250 or more gig workers worldwide that offers pre-arranged delivery services for compensation using an online-enabled application or platform to connect customers with workers for delivery from one or more of the following: eating and drinking establishments, food processing establishments, grocery stores, or any facility supplying groceries or prepaid food and beverages for an online order. It's important to note that when OLS is determining who is a covered FDNC, we're not scrutinizing what is being delivered, but where workers are delivering from. Even some companies that offer delivery services, but not necessarily just food, could be covered if they do offer food, beverage, or grocery delivery. So who's covered under this law? Well, it's gig workers. Anyone accepting offers or prearranged delivery services for compensation from an FDNC. All FDNC workers who perform work in Seattle also have gig worker paid sick and save time rights, including gig workers who are not legally authorized to work in the United States. Per City of Seattle policy, OLS does not ask people about their immigration status, and we investigate complaints without regard to an individual's immigrant status. To be covered by the law, a gig worker must make a trip or delivery with a drop-off or pickup point in Seattle. If a worker is covered under traditional employer-provided labor standards, they are not covered under gig worker premium pay from that hiring entity. Essentially, the worker cannot get both gig worker premium pay and minimum wage from the same company for the same work. If the worker is entitled to full employee labor standards, they must get those protections. The additional compensation or premium pay a worker must receive for fulfilling a delivery order with the pickup or drop-off point in Seattle is $2.50 per order. A worker is also owed the following additional amounts if applicable to the same online order. That's $1.25 for each additional pickup point in Seattle and $1.25 for each additional drop-off point in Seattle. To ensure compliance, FDNCs must adhere to the following requirements of the law: pay premium pay at the same time compensation is provided for the rest of the online order, identify which orders qualify as premium pay, separately itemize premium pay from other compensation, and provide workers with a written notice of rights. The notice of rights must inform gig workers they have a right to premium pay as guaranteed by the law, protection from retaliation, and a right to file a complaint with the Office of Labor Standards or file a civil action or lawsuit. The notice of rights shall be provided by phone application or through an online web portal in English and in the worker's primary language. Additionally, FD&Cs are prohibited from taking any adverse action if they are taken as a result of this law going into effect. For example, reducing a worker's compensation or limiting a worker's earning capacity. Furthermore, FD&Cs are prohibited from adding premium pay charges to the customer for grocery order deliveries, and FD&Cs cannot reduce or modify service areas in Seattle. Now, quick note, FD&Cs can add premium pay customer charges for other food delivery. And last, retaliation is prohibited. So retaliation is illegal. Hiring entities and all others are prohibited from taking any adverse action or discriminating against gig workers who assert their rights to gig worker premium pay. These rights include, but are not limited to, using or asking to use gig worker premium pay, informing a hiring entity or legal counsel about alleged gig worker premium pay violations, filing a complaint about alleged gig worker premium pay violations, participating in an investigation of alleged premium pay violations, or informing other gig workers of their premium pay rights. Well, this concludes our webinar on Seattle gig worker protections. I'd like to thank my colleague Jasmine Marwaha for joining me. We hope you found the information helpful. Feel free to contact our office for more questions. Questions from hiring entities are not shared with our enforcement team, and similarly, information from workers who call our office are kept confidential. Language interpretation and translation is available. Accommodations for persons with disabilities are provided, and our services are free. Our direct line is 206-256-5297. There's also an option to send us a message through our online inquiry form located on our website at www.seattle.gov/labor standards. Workers can email us directly using the following email: laborstandards@seattle.gov. Businesses can email us directly using the following email: business.laborstandards@seattle.gov. Thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your day.